Malcolm X was the smartest uneducated. You see, Malcolm X, they could find nobody with no degree of PhD could debate him on truth. And naturally, this country can't stand truth. Now, I was lecturing the other day down in this same cellar, and a gang of little black boys came in. They held up their fists, talking about black power. I said, look, son, I'd like to straighten you out. I said, black is beautiful, but black isn't power. Knowledge is power. For you can be black as a crow, you can be white as snow, and if you don't know and ain't got no dough, you can't go, and that's for sure. The white man that landed here, he came with two great weapons. One is the Bible, and the other was the gun. If it didn't humble you with the Bible, it crumble you with the gun. And it's still praising the Lord and passing the ammunition all over the world.
You know, the points he said about black power, I think is very, very, very important. But you have to grow and change. You can't just be caught up in the racial aspect of it. You have to, he said in the little poem he said you have to know and you have to have the dough. You know, you can't just be caught up in, oh, do it just because it's black. So it's interesting that he ran a black bookstore. He understood the importance of the bookstore, but he also understood it's not just about the black. You know, that's a tool. That's not the goal.
Anybody can die nobly for a cause. The sign of maturity is to live day by day for that cause. That cause is not a racial cause. He is here, somewhere else it's a religious cause, something, but it's really just simply freedom. Okie doke.
Somewhat of a different focus, very different focus than the civil rights movement slide that we closed the 50s lecture on. Remember, go back to that slide, look at it. Every single major event listed from 54 to 1963. Southern incident, right? It happened in the South. The lone exception, Brown v. Board, which was with the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, a free state. Although there were other school districts involved in that lawsuit that were Southern, right? Here, the rise of black power, if you look at this slide, one of the, is it 5 points on this? One of the points, 5 of them, the last one is Mexico City, which is not the United States. It's technically the South because it's, you know, south of the United States, but we're not counting that one. And the one above that, Martin Luther King Jr., which we'll discuss, is his assassination in Memphis. The other 3, the top 3, are all northern cities: New York, Los Angeles, and Oakland. So let's get into the rise of black power. You cannot really understand black power and the concept of black power and what the black power movement, black militancy, and this shift, this different voice, this younger voice in many instances, you cannot really fully understand it without going back before the term black power was even used by Stokely Carmichael in 1966. And he uses it in Mississippi, so that's a southern place too, my bad. He uses it in Mississippi. He uses it following the march by James Meredith, who I mentioned when he was shot. So you have to go back even to Malcolm X, as far as an immediate predecessor. Malcolm X, formerly Malcolm Little, the son of Marcus Garvey followers, or at least his father was a Marcus Garvey follower, if you remember from the end of the World War I lecture. It's sort of in the early stages of the Harlem Renaissance, right? And even prior to the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, you had 150,000 people from the West Indies, Jamaica, Barbados, whatever, Trinidad and Tobago, which is where Stokely Carmichael is from. But you had all these people migrate to America, and you have a substantial Jamaican presence in New York, in Harlem. This is where Marcus Garvey is from, Jamaica, and then he ends up living in Harlem. Pan-Africanism that Garvey espouses, that Malcolm X's father followed, right? Pan-Africanism and Black Power are in essence the same thing, because Black Power, what is really it's really about is not necessarily power. The concept of black is power, but black is beautiful, right? The idea of embracing who you are, embracing your natural hair, your natural skin color. Stop, not trying to change or modify the way you look, or the way you feel, or the way you think, in a world that is basically, constructed on European, Anglo-American, values and a mindset, right? So, Pan-Africanism of Garvey influences Malcolm X's father, who was actually murdered early on. I think it's page 10 of the autobiography of Malcolm X. That's how dangerous Marcus Garvey, arguably was. A follower of his, Malcolm X's father, makes it into page 10 of a very lengthy autobiography. He dies very early in Malcolm X's life, when he was still Malcolm Little. According to Malcolm X, my father's skull on one side was crushed in. I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked, and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run him over. His body was cut almost in half. I mean, he had gone to school, primary school, but had no higher education, had been basically what you would describe as a hood or a hoodlum, right? A thief, prison, becomes a follower of Islam, the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. And he is out of prison and preaching at Temple number 7 in Harlem by, I believe, 1953. So not only is this important for preceding Black Power, but this is before the Brown v. Board decision, and definitely before the Montgomery bus boycott, when the nation learns about Martin Luther King, right? This Malcolm X is already out there preaching the faith of Islam, the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, right? So that by 1965, this guy is a very powerful, prominent figure in the Nation of Islam, which by 1965 he has been thrown out of more than the movement, right? The Nation of Islam was an organization, was a group. He had transcended the group and was becoming, as an individual, a very influential person. And was also beginning to shift from a lot of the rhetoric of the nation, which you heard at the beginning with the Farrakhan speech about the white devil, right? And speaking more specifically about racism. Not that white people are the devil, but that there's racism in our society, and some would argue putting the blame for that on the doorstep of capitalism, right? Embracing more of a cooperative, collective, socialist style a worldview, right? Which the Black Panthers are definitely, they would refer to themselves as black nationalists or black socialist revolutionaries. So it's very influential. But on February 21st, 1965, in Washington Heights, which is just north of Harlem. It's on 165th Avenue, where he's shot at a place called Audubon Hall. Harlem ends around 145th Avenue, so it's about 20 blocks north of that. He's shot by definitely at least one member of the Nation of Islam, or it's believed at least one member of the Nation of Islam, possibly a New York police officer. There's all sorts of speculation around it. This is a very militant black man in New York, predominantly white police officers, in northern cities at the time. In many cities that's still the case, but also with all the rhetoric from the Nation of Islam that he had been espousing for a long time about the white devil, not living amongst whites, black, sort of what you might call black supremacy, what was labeled black supremacy. When he's murdered, there's not going to be that great of an investigation by the police surrounding the murder, right? But it's generally accepted that either the Nation of Islam leadership or some sort of rogue elements within the Nation of Islam had a hand in his death, possibly with support of the New York Police Department, the FBI. So, Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. Shortly thereafter, and not as a direct result of it by any means, but due to various things, there is a riot in Watts. There actually was a riot in Harlem in 1964, right? The previous year before Malcolm X is assassinated. He's assassinated February 65. In the summer of 65, there is a man pulled over in Watts, which is an area of Los Angeles, predominantly black area of Los Angeles. The man is pulled over for suspected to be driving under the influence. There's an altercation with the police. A crowd forms around, and it erupts into basically a multi-day riot. Important things to know, obviously, well, I don't know, I mean, I would hope you would think, obviously, people in an entire city aren't just going to burn buildings to the ground and destroy property because of a guy getting busted for a DUI, right? This is one of those instances where the phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back, or the last straw, right, which is this, same thing, occurs. The Los Angeles Police Department notoriously recruited white men from the South to patrol the streets of Los Angeles, in many instances in predominantly black neighborhoods. Right, people came from a Jim Crow segregated South where they were white, and they are raised with these white supremacist viewpoints. They're raised possibly with close family members in the Ku Klux Klan, and all of us, and they're now expected to be in a California city, patrolling it. That creates tension. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. However, after that, at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, there is a sort of a refusal to seat delegates from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was basically black and white, but folks from Mississippi that claimed the normal state delegates at the convention from Mississippi were the segregated delegates. They were all white delegates, and the delegates formed by Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party included all Mississippians. Blacks could vote. They wanted black people to vote, white people to vote, and these are the people that they chose. Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats agreed to seat 2 of these delegates as a compromise. But still, after the Civil Rights Act is signed, there's been a major concession is made within the Democratic Party to the Southern Manifesto veto, that whole concept, right? Conceding to that group, even though Johnson ends up losing Mississippi anyways. And I don't think the Democratic Party has ever won Mississippi since the 50s, early 60s in a presidential election. So you have that. You have the you have issues of cities in the north, Los Angeles and elsewhere, blocking elements of the Civil Rights Act, which had already passed, that deal with fair housing. Right. This is really the main area where you will find complaints of racism in the north. And if you look at urban planning, or if you look at I've mentioned this before, the Case for Reparations article in The Atlantic, you will see the culpability of northern cities as far as housing discrimination. And this is really how you maintain a segregated society in the north, what you would call de facto segregation, in fact. Not de jure, which is in law. There are no laws, like there are no black codes like they had in the South. There are no labels on fountains, whites only, blacks only, right? There are no explicitly stated separate schools, but if you build a city and you only rent in certain neighborhoods to certain groups, you're going to separate the groups. They're going to end up in separate schools, and they're going to end up with separate level of resources, right? Job discrimination, housing. If you go into a bank and you don't get a loan because of the way you look, you can't necessarily prove that, but it happens, and then you don't get a loan to buy that house. You can't move into that neighborhood. You see what I'm saying? So all of these things come together. Obviously not every single person in Watts who was looting was necessarily thinking and articulating these things in their head, right? But this is just the general sort of climate of the nation, of the city of Los Angeles, when this routine DUI stop sort of escalates, the crowd forms, and it turns into a what's called the Watts Uprising. The important thing about the Watts Uprising, it's one of the first substantial riots in which black Americans are the rioters, right? Pretty much every single race riot, if you hear something referred to as a race riot, or the New York City draft riots of 1863, pretty much every one of those up until the 1960s are white mobs going into black neighborhoods and attacking them. The New York draft riots is the most well-known, but you have Brownsville, Omaha, St. Louis, all these different cities at various points in the 1800s, early 1900s. So this is one of the first substantial moments where black Americans are upset about something and express that anger through violence, which is, I'm not going to say is negative or positive. You can decide what you want, but that's, if we're going to talk about militancy, you don't have to be violent to be militant, but expressing violence publicly like that is definitely could be seen as an empowering thing. Or the following year, in 1966, is when, in the summer of 1966, Stokely Carmichael, frustrated about the apparent lack of progress, the violence against James Meredith, against other folks. In 1966, you have King, who goes to Chicago, Martin Luther King, a northern city, takes his message to the north, and has an experience there with some of the white residents, many working class white ethnic residents of Chicago, which leads Dr. Martin Luther King to say that Chicago was the most racist city and the worst experience he had had in any part of America, north or south. All right, and also James Meredith's march, in which he is shot. This is after the Civil Rights Act is passed. There's still this clear lack of what they see as lack of concern for their lives, lack of concern for their ability to pursue happiness, achieve equality, all those things. It creates a lot of frustration, right? And so Stokely Carmichael, in July of 1966, gives, I'm not sure if this is the very first speech on Black Power, but definitely sort of elaborates on the concept of Black Power and closes the speech with the statement, "We have to organize ourselves to speak for each other." That's Black Power. We have to move to control the economics and politics of our community. That's important, right? We have to move to control the economics and politics of our community. And why is that important? Well, if you look a few months later at the Black Panther Party in October of 1966, the Black Panther Party of Oakland, California, right? Oaktown, respect. We're gonna have there are I believe 6 original members of the Black Panther Party, but 2 of them, the 2 prominent ones, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. Bobby Seale is still alive. Huey P. Newton is no longer living, but they author what is called the Black Panther Party 10-point plan, right? And like the populist platform in the 1890s, I want to focus, and like Wilson's 14 points, I don't want to look at all of them. I want to focus on just a few here. Okay, let's look at points 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the Black Panther Party 10-point plan. I'm emphasizing these in a similar fashion to how I emphasized various points of the populist platform, because these are 4 points of a 10-point platform of a radical organization, in this instance a black nationalist, socialist, revolutionary, they've had several labels, Black Power Group, militant, will eventually be specifically targeted by the Nixon administration through the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. Members will be assassinated. Not even in certain instances there were likely shootouts. There were certain rogue elements that broke off and started robbing banks and stuff like that. But if you look at Fred Hampton, 21 years old, organizer for the Black Panthers in Chicago, is shot in his bed. He's in his boxers, sleeping in his bed with his girlfriend who's pregnant, who I think just had a kid or she's pregnant, murdered, cold blood. But let's look at these, because these are radical ideas at the time. All of them are going to become really mainstream concepts, or are still prevalent among radical groups But so what mainstream groups? Let's just go into it. We want education. Number 5, we want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. Ethnic studies, right? This is an organization that's going to help establish ethnic studies, which is a standard at the University of California system and a lot of the CSUs, even at the high school level, right? It was originally called TWANUS, Third World and Native American Studies, TWANUS, ethnic studies, right? This is common now. Pretty much every university, community college, even high schools have ethnic studies, right? Even a large element of the history that Foner writes about is a social history, ethnic studies, right? Which has social history has roots with E.P. Thompson, Studs Terkel, but also ethnic group, like social groups, class, gender, race, ethnicity, right? That's common practice. Number 6, we want all black men to be exempt from military service, and the justification. There are longer. These points are drawn out into more and more sentences, right, to elaborate on these points. So in this instance, we want all black men to be exempt from military service. They elaborate by saying that this is a society that treats us unequally. It's racist. And it is asking us to go fight other non-white people that, where racism plays a factor in our bombing of basically Vietnam, right? This is important. One reason, this is in 1966. The following year, this is the same argument that is going to be given by the heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali, to selective service. When he is drafted, he's going to refuse to serve, and the argument he's going to say publicly is, no Viet Cong ever called me nigger, right? The idea that why am I going to kill another non-white group that, many people in this country do not care if we bomb that country because of racism. I'm being treated as a second-class citizen because of racism. Why am I having to go kill, people for this country that doesn't treat me equally? That whole idea. It's very similar to the Returning Soldiers article by Du Bois. Although he supported entry into World War I, he did say, we will return to a nation where we are lynched, we are lacking education, we are lacking the franchise, right? All these things are still being repeated. Number 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. Black lives matter, right? This is still an issue. This is an issue, as you'll see in the early 90s with the Rodney King incident, who was not murdered, but who was savagely beaten. This is, you look at the last several years, going back to 2012, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, right? This was an issue then, it is an issue now, and then this relates to the 8th point. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails, right? They've specified black people. They want this for black people in each one, but this is not necessarily. It's definitely more for effect. This is an organization that worked alongside white radicals, white anti-war activists. So don't read into it too much. But we want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. 7 and 8 relate in that it's a referendum on what they believe to be a totally racist, inherently racist criminal justice system from the time of being stopped by the police, being arrested, being booked, being tried, being incarcerated, convicted and incarcerated. Right, the whole system to them is a corrupt one, and is inherently racist. At the time they are writing this in 1966, there are fewer than 250,000, 250,000 people, entirely people, white, black, Latino, Asian. There are fewer than 250,000 in all the federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails in the United States. Why? Because the war on drugs does not exist. Since the war on drugs is launched in the 70s, you go from 250,000 inmates around 1972 to our world today, where we have between 2 and 3 million people behind bars. We are the largest, we incarcerate, have more people behind bars than any nation on earth, more than Saudi Arabia, China, or Iran, the United States, the leader in that. And important for number 8 too is Angela Davis, who has written a lot, spent the bulk of her career as an academic professor on prison reform and rethinking our concept of the prison system. She's not a member of the Black Panthers, but she's an ally and a contemporary, very much so. Yeah, and she would highlight that before the Civil War, when slavery, in 1860, 90% of the prisons, 90% of the inmates in southern prisons are white. After the Civil War, it's a reversal. If you look at the percentage of really across the board among, there's more white people in our prisons than anybody else, but white people make up like 65% of the population of the country, right? African Americans make up 12% of the general population in this country, make up nearly like 30-40% of the prison population. What does that mean? That means if you're walking across a prison yard, you are 3 times more likely to bump into a black person than you are walking down the streets, any street in America. If you look at a few years after this, you have Attica, the Attica uprising, Attica prison riot, I think 1970-71. It's a common thing today. If you look to the image on the right, which ties into some of the other points, but not specifically, but the image on the right is part of what the Black Panthers would call their free breakfast program, right? Excuse me. They had free healthcare, free clothing, free shelter for people, organizing community at the community grassroots level, non-governmental. This is really almost like what Emma Goldman, the anarcho-communist philosophy revolved around, the idea of communities organizing and running things themselves in a collective way. If you look at the Seattle General Strike of 1919, I'm not sure if Foner mentions it, but if you go to the St. Louis General Strike of 1876, the Paris Commune of 1848, the Black Panther Party of 1966, the free breakfast program. If you are hungry, if you are a child, if you're in a low income, underfed, area lacking resources, we will feed you breakfast. This is this is standard practice in California public schools. This is a policy in California public schools. Willie Brown, as a state senator, former mayor of San Francisco, before that he was a state senator, African American politician, definitely, I'm not sure if he was, what kind of relationship he had with the leadership of the Black Panthers or the party itself, but was definitely from the Bay Area, aware of this group, of age, where he was, of college age, young African American male at the time this organization was forming in the, heat of the civil rights movement, at the height of the civil rights movement, and he's one of the state senators that makes this this public policy. If your child comes to a public school and they are hungry, they will be fed. This is something that you would almost consider just a basic human decency thing, but it's also practical. Children go to school. If they are, you're already making the kids wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning to go to school. They're not learning anything at that time. It's not the best time to start school. Probably should start later. The days should probably be shorter. The school year should probably be longer. Most definitely, if kids are showing up without any food in their stomach, they should be fed. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. Kids aren't going to learn. They're tired. They're hungry. Who knows what kind of neighborhoods they've had to crisscross through to get to school, what kind of violence and drug abuse they've seen. The least you can do is give them a bowl of cornflakes, right? This is actually the free breakfast program, and this is very important to remember, because if you think Black Panthers, people think guns. People think of the guns and the berets and the leather jackets and these black guys holding shotguns. You look at Martin Luther King, Christian, wears a tie, clean cut, right, holding hands with white people, juxtaposed to afro, shotgun, mean look on their face, right? Yet it's the free breakfast program which is labeled the biggest threat to national security by J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI and by the Nixon administration. Not the biggest threat coming from this party. It is the biggest threat that the government faces to their security and to the security of this country. The Black Panther Party of Oakland, California, and their free breakfast program. The biggest threat to national security. And go back to the World War I Espionage Sedition Acts and what that did to some of the labor organizations who were persecuted, not necessarily because they were committing espionage. You see what I'm saying? So this is a radical organization that ties into a lot of history, black and white, and at the same time, this organization is going to be quickly targeted, and people are going to be assassinated, forced into exile. A woman who was a member of the Black Panthers, who is still on the FBI's most wanted list, who's I believe currently is still living in exile in Cuba, who also happens to be the aunt of a guy you may know of, Tupac Shakur. Folks, I think Eldridge Cleaver and his wife are going to move to Algiers. This message, many of these points are still seen as substantially relevant by lots of people, by lots of young people, and some of them are, have become common practice. Next point, Martin Luther King Jr., April 1968. April 4th, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. The man convicted of his assassination is a man named James Earl Ray, who eventually the King family, members of the King family, will meet with this gentleman in prison, communicate with him, and actually come to believe that he is not the assassin. There was a conspiracy behind his murder. Shortly after the King assassination, the country, major cities across the country erupt in riots, right? There's already a tension, as you see, with the Watts uprising, with the Nation of Islam, with the Black Panther Party. There's an increasing militancy, which does not necessarily mean violence, but posturing, not the I have a dream, image we see of King. Having said that, I believe exactly 1 year before his assassination, April 4th, 1968, in April of 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to come out publicly against the war in Vietnam. Remember, the March on Washington in '63 was for jobs and freedom. He is going to be in Memphis, where he's assassinated, in solidarity with a group of striking sanitation workers. So this is a man who is embracing, while not embracing the level of militancy of some of these other groups, is definitely making a connection between, in their, and this is how they see it. I'm not saying you should see it this way. Making the connection between capitalism, militarism, racism, right? And the idea of advocating for economic justice as well as political justice and social justice. And there are a lot of folks within the movement, historians that believe that there were greater forces at work behind his murder that relate to him challenging more than just separate drinking fountains, separate schools, but challenging economic inequality, challenging American foreign policy, right? During the Cold War. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a very controversial figure in his time. That is something we need to remember. That he was very controversial, that today we have a national holiday for him. He's seen as, and that's because he has a national holiday. Martin Luther King Jr. has a national holiday. When Malcolm X's face appeared on a stamp, there was controversy, right? One gentleman, King, there's an entire day we get off from school, from work, to celebrate his life. The life that, that they package for us, where he's peaceful and holding hands with white people, and it's all hunky-dory, right? Malcolm X, on the other hand, ends up on a stamp, just a stamp, and it's a big deal. It's controversial. People think he shouldn't be on there. But that's, but Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks from the Montgomery bus boycott, would have considered herself more aligned with the philosophy of Malcolm X than King. Martin Luther King Jr. was a controversial figure in his time. He did take a stance against the war in Vietnam. He did take a stance in solidarity with striking workers in certain instances. Seminal figure of the civil rights movement of this era is assassinated. Two months later, in California, Robert Kennedy, who's running for president, will be assassinated. 1968 is a very tumultuous year. It's really seen as the moment where the potential of even greater change coming from the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, coming from the student movement of the 1960s, protesting the war, the free speech movement at Berkeley, all of these things, creating a society that more to their likeness, right? Tolerance or equality, whatever you want to attach to it. But really, 1968 is seen as this moment where there was a lot of potential and things just exploded. There were riots, there were assassinations. There was a police riot at the Democratic National Convention that summer. And in the aftermath of that, Richard Nixon becomes president, who proceeds to expand the Vietnam War by bombing Cambodia, who carries out very sort of extra-legal, clandestine political sabotage against the opposition party, the Democrats, vis-a-vis Watergate, all sorts of things that really create a sour taste in people's mouths about the role of government, liberalism, and the possibility. Neoconservative, the term neoconservative, really, new conservative, used to specifically mean people who were for the civil rights movement, who were liberals, who may have been Democrats, who became so disenchanted with the late 1960s, so disenchanted with what happened after the civil rights movement, after the Civil Rights Act, that they became conservative, right? What's called white backlash, which you can maybe draw similarities with the last election in November of 2016. But before that election in November of 1968, where we get Richard Nixon, there are Summer Olympics being held in October, which is a little after summer, in Mexico City. Olympics that are held about 10 days after a massive student protest by Mexican students in Mexico City, in which the police and military open fire and kill hundreds of students. And with all of this going on, there is a moment at the 1968 Olympics, a few moments of protest. The one that is iconic that we remember involves two students from San Jose State University who are track stars, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Tommy Smith wins the gold medal in the 200 meter. John Carlos wins the bronze. And as the American flag is raised, two American flags are raised, the national anthem is played. These two gentlemen do what is referred to as the Black Power salute. They hold up their fists in protest and drop their heads, refusing to recognize the American flag. We look at this image, and it's a still photograph. We don't have sound. It's seen today as a very proud moment, or a very stoic, brave moment. It was a moment where these men were jeered, booed. They had their medals taken away from them. They were kicked out of the Olympic Village. John Carlos's wife, a decade later, after death threat, she had her own depression issues, but death threats and whatnot, is going to commit suicide. There was actually a movement to boycott the Olympics altogether, not wanting to represent the United States. It was called the Olympic Human Rights Committee, or the Olympic Committee on Human Rights. If you look at the picture of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and I forget it's from Australia, the white guy who won the silver medal, barely edged out John Carlos. He actually is wearing the button of the Olympic Human Rights Committee. There's other pictures you can see of these gentlemen, all three together, being very friendly. He was in solidarity with them. The reason that he doesn't have a fist in the air with them is not just because he's white and it's the Black Power salute. it's because they only had one pair of gloves, right? If you notice, Tommy Smith has a right hand in the air. John Carlos has a left hand in the air. I said a black hand in the air. It was a black hand, but it was also his left hand, a left fist. So there was, one glove for each of them. And the statue at San Jose State, if you ever go to San Jose State, you see the statue. He agreed with the concept of leaving his space empty so that people could stand there in solidarity with these two gentlemen, John Carlos and Tommy Smith.